The morning mist clung to the gates of Rayfield Manor like ghostly fingers, unwilling to let go of their secrets. Camilla Thornberry stood at her bedroom window, watching the black cars wind up her driveway with the slow certainty of funeral procession. She had been expecting this day for months, ever since the whispers started in the village, ever since the lawyer's letters began arriving with increasing urgency, ever since her late husband's debts finally caught up with his widow. At 62, Camilla had lived through enough storms to recognize when the winds were changing direction. Her hands, still elegant despite the years of worry, gripped the silk curtains as she counted the vehicles. 3 official cars, 2 police escorts, and what appeared to be a removal van bringing up the rear. The royal watch had come calling, and they meant business. The doorbell's ancient chime echoed through the manor's empty halls, a sound that had once welcomed kings and queens during more prosperous times. Now it announced the end of an era. Camilla's housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, had left 3 weeks ago when the last paycheck bounced. The gardener had stopped coming when the grounds began to look like a jungle. Even the dogs had been rehomed to her sister in Scotland, leaving Camilla alone with her memories and her mounting fears. She descended the grand staircase slowly, her heels clicking against marble that her great-grandfather had imported from Italy in 1897. Each step felt like a small defeat. Each portrait on the wall seemed to watch her with disappointment. The Thornberry family had owned this estate for over 2 centuries, surviving wars, economic crashes, and social upheavals. Yet here she was, about to lose it all because her husband had made some very poor financial decisions in his final years. The man standing on her doorstep wore the crisp uniform of the royal watch, complete with gold braiding and ceremonial sword. His face was neither kind nor cruel, simply professional. Behind him stood 2 assistants carrying clipboards and cameras, ready to document every valuable item in the house. The legal paperwork in his hands looked thick enough to rival the local phone book. "Mrs. Thornberry," he began, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "I am Inspector Malcolm Hartwell of Her Majesty's Royal Watch. I have here a court order for the immediate seizure of this property and all its contents to satisfy the outstanding debts of the Thornberry estate. You have been served notice of these proceedings, and the deadline for payment has passed." Camilla nodded, though her throat felt too tight to speak. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it as best she could. Yet standing here facing the reality felt like drowning in slow motion. The debts totaled nearly £3 million, money that her husband Richard had borrowed against the estate to fund his failed business ventures. When he died suddenly of a heart attack 2 years ago, those debts became her responsibility, along with a property that had been mortgaged to its foundation stones. "I understand," she finally managed, stepping aside to let the officials enter. "I have packed a small bag as instructed. The house is yours to catalog and claim." Inspector Hartwell's expression softened slightly as he looked around the magnificent entrance hall. Even in its current state of gentle decay, Rayfield Manor retained an undeniable grandeur. The crystal chandelier caught the morning light and scattered rainbows across the faded wallpaper. Persian rugs that had once graced the floors of palaces now showed worn patches from decades of family life. Oil paintings depicting long-dead aristocrats gazed down from their gilded frames with expressions of eternal dignity. "This is never easy," Hartwell said quietly, removing his hat as he entered. "But we must follow the law. The contents will be cataloged and valued, then sold at auction to satisfy the debts.
Anything remaining will be returned to you, though I should warn you that properties of this size rarely leave much behind after all obligations are met." His assistants began their work immediately,
photographing rooms and making detailed notes of every piece of furniture, every ornament, every book on the shelves. They moved through the house like efficient ghosts, reducing a lifetime of memories to line items on inventory sheets. Camilla followed at a distance, watching strangers handle objects that held decades of personal history. In the library, they cataloged her husband's first edition books and the leather reading chair where he had spent countless evenings. In the dining room, they measured the mahogany table that had hosted Christmas dinners for 5 generations of Thornberrys. Each room told a story that the officials would never know, stories that would be scattered to the winds once the auction hammers fell. The process would take several days, Hartwell explained as they worked their way through 23 rooms, 3 floors and numerous outbuildings. Camilla would be allowed to remain in the property until the cataloging was complete, after which she would need to find alternative accommodation. Her sister had offered her a small flat in Edinburgh, a kind gesture that felt like charity to a woman who had once hosted members of Parliament in her drawing room. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the manor's grounds, Camilla found herself in the small sitting room that had been her personal sanctuary. Here, among her mother's watercolors and her grandmother's needlepoint cushions, she allowed herself a moment of private grief. The officials were working in the main reception rooms, their voices and footsteps echoing through the house like a countdown to goodbye. She opened the writing desk where she kept her most precious correspondence, letters from friends and family dating back to her wedding day. Among them lay a sealed envelope that Richard had given her just weeks before his death, with strict instructions not to open it unless the very worst happened. At the time, she had assumed he was being overly dramatic about his heart condition. Now facing the loss of everything they had built together, she wondered if he had known more about their financial situation than he had admitted. The envelope felt heavier than it should in her trembling hands, as if it contained more than just paper and ink. Whatever Richard's final message might be, she was not yet ready to face it. Instead, she tucked it into her jacket pocket, a small secret to carry with her into an uncertain future. Outside her window, Inspector Hartwell was examining the rose garden with the same methodical attention he had applied to the house's interior. Even the grounds would be evaluated for their potential value, she realized. Nothing would escape the reaching grasp of debt and duty. The second day of the seizure brought rain that drummed against the manor's ancient windows like impatient fingers. Camilla woke in what would likely be her last morning in the master bedroom, a room that had sheltered 6 generations of her husband's family. The officials had already begun cataloging the upper floors, their voices drifting through the walls as they documented each piece of inherited furniture, each faded tapestry, each tarnished candlestick. Inspector Hartwell found her in the morning room, where she sat nursing a cup of tea and watching the rain cascade down the tall windows. The grounds looked particularly melancholy in the gray light, with overgrown hedges and neglected flower beds speaking of better times now past. He carried a manila folder thick with photographs and inventory sheets, the accumulated weight of her family's possessions reduced to bureaucratic paperwork. "Mrs. Thornberry," he said, settling into the chair across from her, "we've encountered something unusual in our cataloging. Several items appear on insurance documents that we cannot locate in the house. Valuable items. I wonder if you might help clarify their whereabouts." Camilla's heart skipped as she set down her teacup. Insurance documents meant Richard's private papers, documents she had never been allowed to see during their marriage. Her husband had always handled the family finances with secretive efficiency, claiming that such matters were too complex and boring for her to worry about. Now, in the harsh light of their financial ruin, his protectiveness seemed more like deliberate concealment. Hartwell opened the folder and spread several photographs across the small table between them. Camilla's breath caught as she recognized items she had never seen before, yet somehow knew intimately from childhood stories and family legends. There was the Ashworth diamond tiara, a piece her great-grandmother had supposedly sold decades ago to pay for repairs to the manor's roof. The Thornberry emerald set, jewelry that her mother had always claimed was lost in a burglary during the war years. According to these insurance valuations, Hartwell continued, his voice carefully neutral, these pieces are worth approximately £800,000. They were insured as recently as last year, which suggests they were in your husband's possession at the time of his death. Yet we have found no trace of them in our search. The photographs seemed to shimmer in the gray morning light, each piece more magnificent than Camilla remembered from the old family albums. The tiara's diamonds caught imaginary light and threw it back in brilliant cascades. The emeralds glowed with an inner fire that spoke of royal courts and grand ballrooms. These were not merely valuable objects but pieces of history, connections to a more glamorous past that she had believed was lost forever. "I don't understand," she said honestly, though her mind was racing. Richard never mentioned having these pieces. "I assumed they had been sold long ago during various family financial difficulties over the years." "Are you certain these insurance documents are current?" Hartwell nodded grimly. "Dated and signed by your husband just 18 months ago. The premiums were paid through an automatic bank transfer until 6 months after his death, when the account ran dry. Mrs. Thornberry, if these items exist and can be located, they would significantly reduce the estate's outstanding debts. It would be in your best interest to help us find them. The implication hung in the air like smoke. If the jewelry could be found, she might not lose everything. The house might still be forfeit, but there could be enough left over to provide some financial security for her uncertain future. The alternative was complete destitution, a prospect that terrified her more than she cared to admit. "May I see the insurance documents?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Hartwell handed her a thick sheaf of papers covered in legal terminology and precise valuations. As she read, a picture began to emerge of her late husband's secret activities. Beyond the jewelry, there were paintings insured for enormous sums, rare books worth more than most people's houses, and decorative objects that belonged in museums rather than private homes. The total value made her dizzy. "These paintings," she said, pointing to several photographs. "I recognize some of them from old family albums, but they haven't hung in this house for at least 50 years. My husband's grandfather supposedly sold them to American collectors during the Depression. Yet here they are, insured by your husband as recently as 2 years ago." Hartwell replied, "Mrs. Thornberry, I must ask you directly. Do you have any knowledge of where these items might be stored? Safety deposit boxes, perhaps, or storage facilities? Friends or relatives who might be holding them?" Camilla's mind went immediately to Richard's mysterious trips during their last years together. Weekend journeys he claimed were related to his business interests. He would return from these excursions energized but secretive, often carrying small packages that he would disappear into his study without explanation. At the time, she had assumed these were related to his failing import business, perhaps samples from potential suppliers or gifts from foreign partners. "There were trips," she said slowly, "weekend journeys that Richard took alone. He said they were business-related, but I never knew the details. He would often return with packages, small items that he kept in his study. I assumed they were business samples or documents." Hartwell leaned forward with renewed interest. "Can you describe these packages? Size, frequency, any particular pattern to the trips?" "Small enough to carry in a briefcase or overnight bag," she replied, remembering. "They happened perhaps once a month, sometimes more frequently. Always to London, or at least he said they were to London. He would leave on Saturday morning and return Sunday evening, usually in a much better mood than when he left." The inspector made detailed notes, his pen scratching across the paper with increasing urgency. "Did he ever mention specific addresses in London? Hotels where he stayed, perhaps, or business associates he met with?" Camilla shook her head, frustrated by her own ignorance of her husband's activities. "Richard was very private about his business affairs. He said it was to protect me from worry, to let me focus on managing the house and our social obligations. I respected his privacy and never pressed for details." "What about his study?" Hartwell asked. "Have you had occasion to go through his papers since his death?" The study, Richard's forbidden sanctum, a room she had been explicitly asked never to enter without his permission. Even after his death, she had respected that boundary, partly from habit and partly from fear of what she might find. The solicitors had removed some documents for probate purposes, but they had focused mainly on wills and financial statements. Personal papers, private correspondence, and business records had remained untouched. "I haven't," she admitted. "It seemed too private, too much like violating his memory. The lawyers took what they needed for the will, but everything else remains as he left it." Hartwell's expression brightened for the first time since his arrival. "With your permission, Mrs. Thornberry, I would like to examine your husband's study more thoroughly. If he was maintaining detailed insurance records on these valuables, there may be other documents that could lead us to their location. Invoices, correspondence, storage receipts, anything that might provide a trail." The prospect both thrilled and terrified her. Finding the missing treasures could change everything, could restore some measure of financial security to her collapsing world, but it would also mean confronting the reality that her husband had maintained significant secrets throughout their marriage, secrets that suggested a life she had never known he was living. Richard's study remained exactly as he had left it on the morning of his fatal heart attack, a shrine to masculine efficiency and scholarly pursuits. Dark mahogany bookshelves lined 3 walls filled with volumes on history, economics, and art appreciation. His massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its leather-inlaid surface still bearing the circular stains from his favorite coffee mug. Even the fountain pen lay precisely where he had placed it after signing what would be his final letter. Camilla hesitated at the threshold, her hand resting on the brass doorknob as Inspector Hartwell waited patiently behind her. 2 years had passed since Richard's death, yet she still felt like an intruder entering the space. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated dancing dust motes, giving the room an almost sacred atmosphere that made her reluctant to disturb its preserved tranquility. "Take your time," Hartwell said gently, understanding her emotional struggle. "I know this must be difficult." She stepped into the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug that Richard had inherited from his father. Everything smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and the lemon oil Mrs. Pemberton had used to polish the wooden furniture. On the desk, a half-finished crossword puzzle lay open to a page dated 2 days before his death, a poignant reminder of the ordinary moments that make up a life. Hartwell began his examination methodically, starting with the obvious places where important documents might be stored. The desk drawers yielded bank statements, business correspondence, and personal letters, but nothing that immediately explained the location of the insured treasures. The filing cabinet contained neat folders labeled with various business ventures, all apparently legitimate but ultimately unsuccessful. "Your husband was very organized," Hartwell observed, leafing through meticulously maintained records, almost obsessively so, which makes it more surprising that we haven't found records relating to items worth nearly £1 million. Camilla wandered to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the familiar spines. She had occasionally borrowed novels from Richard's collection, but many of the volumes were specialized texts that held no interest for her: art history, auction catalogs, insurance valuations for antiques and collectibles. It struck her now as odd that a man whose business involved importing office furniture would maintain such an extensive library on fine art and antiquities. "Inspector," she called softly, pulling a thick volume from the shelf. "Look at this." The book was titled European Royal Jewels, a comprehensive catalog, and appeared to be heavily used with numerous bookmarks and handwritten notes in the margins. As she flipped through the pages, she found detailed annotations next to several pieces, including mathematical calculations that looked suspiciously like profit margins. One page had been dog-eared and marked with a red circle around a photograph of an ornate diamond necklace. Hartwell abandoned his search through the desk drawers and joined her at the bookshelf. Together they discovered that nearly half of Richard's book collection focused on valuable art objects, antique jewelry, and historical artifacts. Many volumes showed signs of intensive study, with notes, calculations, and cross-references scrawled throughout. It painted a picture of a man whose interests went far beyond importing office supplies. "Mrs. Thornberry," Hartwell said carefully, "I think we need to consider the possibility that your husband was involved in activities you knew nothing about. These books suggest someone with deep knowledge of valuable objects, someone who understood their market value and historical significance." The implications made Camilla feel dizzy. Had Richard been living a double life? Was the failing import business merely a cover for something else entirely? She sank into his leather reading chair, overwhelmed by the possibility that her husband of 30 years had been a complete stranger to her. As she sat there trying to process this revelation, her hand automatically reached for the chair's armrest and encountered something unexpected. There was a slight ridge in the leather, barely perceptible but definitely present. Running her fingers along the edge, she discovered what felt like a hidden seam carefully concealed within the chair's upholstery. "Inspector," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something here." Hartwell knelt beside the chair and examined the area she indicated. With careful pressure, a section of the armrest's leather covering came away to reveal a hidden compartment containing a small brass key and a folded piece of paper. The key was old-fashioned, ornate, and unlike any modern lock key either of them had ever seen. The paper contained a single line of text in Richard's precise handwriting. Behind the false Dickens, third shelf, complete works. They turned to the bookshelf with renewed intensity, searching for anything related to Charles Dickens. On the third shelf, they found a complete set of Dickens novels in matching leather bindings. As Hartwell pulled the volumes forward, they discovered that the books were hollow facades, expertly crafted to conceal a hidden panel in the wall behind them. The brass key fit perfectly into a nearly invisible lock within the panel. As it turned, there was a soft click, and a section of the wall swung inward to reveal a narrow passage that led into darkness. The air that emerged was cool and dry, suggesting a well-ventilated space beyond. Hartwell produced a flashlight from his jacket and shone its beam into the opening, revealing stone steps descending into what appeared to be a basement chamber. "Did you know this passage existed?" Hartwell asked, though Camilla's expression of complete shock answered his question before she could speak. "I had no idea," she breathed. "This house is over 200 years old, and I thought I knew every room, every closet, every corner of it. How could Richard have known about something I didn't?" They descended the stone steps carefully, Hartwell's flashlight beam dancing ahead of them. The passage was clearly old, probably dating to the house's original construction, but it had been recently maintained. The walls were dry, the air was fresh, and electric lighting had been installed along the ceiling. At the bottom of the steps, they found a heavy wooden door with modern locks and a digital keypad. "This is far more sophisticated than I expected," Hartwell murmured, examining the electronic security system. "Your husband went to considerable expense and effort to protect whatever lies beyond this door." The keypad blinked patiently, waiting for the correct code. Camilla stared at it helplessly, trying to think of numbers that might have been significant to Richard. Their wedding date, his birthday, her birthday, the date they bought the house, none of them worked. The system remained stubbornly locked, protecting secrets that might hold the key to her financial salvation. Then she remembered the envelope Richard had given her before his death, the one she still carried in her jacket pocket with instructions to open it only if the very worst happened. With trembling hands, she retrieved it and broke the wax seal. Inside was a brief letter and a small card with a 6-digit number written in Richard's careful script. "My dearest Camilla," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then our financial situation has become desperate, and you have discovered my secret chamber. I never wanted you to know about this side of my life, but circumstances have forced my hand. The number on the card will open the vault. What you find inside belongs to you now, though I pray you will use it wisely. I have made mistakes, grave mistakes, but everything I did was to protect our future together. Please forgive me for the secrets I kept and the dangers I may have brought to our door. Your loving husband, Richard." The 6-digit code from Richard's letter worked with a satisfying electronic beep, and the heavy door swung open to reveal a chamber that took Camilla's breath away. The room beyond was not the damp basement she had expected, but a climate-controlled vault that rivaled anything she might have seen in a high-end museum. Track lighting illuminated glass display cases arranged throughout the space, each containing objects that glittered and gleamed with unmistakable value and artistry. Inspector Hartwell stepped into the chamber behind her, his flashlight now unnecessary in the bright artificial lighting. His sharp intake of breath echoed her own amazement as they took in the scope of Richard's hidden collection. This was not the accumulation of a casual collector or even a serious enthusiast. This was a treasury that belonged in royal palaces and national museums. The first display case they approached contained the jewelry from the insurance photographs, but seeing them in person was an entirely different experience. The Ashworth diamond tiara sat on a velvet stand, its dozens of stones catching the light and throwing prismatic rainbows across the walls. Each diamond was perfectly cut, ranging from small accent stones to a central brilliant that was easily the size of a walnut. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the kind of work that could only have been done by the most skilled artisans of a bygone era. "Dear God," Hartwell whispered, moving to examine the emerald set in the adjacent case. "These aren't just valuable pieces, Mrs. Thornberry. These are historically significant artifacts. This emerald necklace, I've seen photographs of it in books about the Victorian era. If I'm not mistaken, it once belonged to a member of the royal family." Camilla felt her knees go weak as the implications began to sink in. Her husband hadn't just been collecting valuable jewelry. He had somehow acquired pieces with royal connections. As they moved deeper into the chamber, each display case revealed treasures that seemed impossible for a private citizen to own. Ornate gold chalices that looked like they belonged in ancient churches, jeweled daggers that might have graced the belts of medieval knights, and paintings that she recognized from art history books. In the center of the room stood a case that made both of them stop and stare in stunned silence. Inside, displayed on a bed of midnight blue velvet, lay a crown that was unmistakably of royal origin. The gold was warm and rich, decorated with precious stones arranged in patterns that spoke of centuries of craftsmanship and tradition. Sapphires the size of robin's eggs alternated with diamonds that captured and reflected the light like captured stars. "This can't be," Hartwell said, his professional composure finally cracking. This looks like, but it can't possibly be. He pulled out his phone and began taking photographs, his hands shaking slightly as he worked. Beside the crown case, a leather-bound ledger lay open on a small reading stand. Camilla approached it with growing trepidation, sensing that whatever was written in those pages would change everything she thought she knew about her husband and her life. The handwriting was Richard's, meticulous and precise as always, but the content was unlike anything she could have imagined. The entries were dated and detailed, describing acquisitions, authentications, and storage arrangements, but these were not the records of a legitimate collector or dealer. The language was careful, coded, speaking of midnight appointments, discreet transfers, and special clients. Numbers in the margin suggested enormous sums of money changing hands, far more than Richard's official business could ever have generated. "Inspector," she said, her voice barely steady, "I think my husband was involved in something illegal. These entries, they suggest he was buying and selling artifacts through channels that avoided official scrutiny." Hartwell joined her at the ledger, scanning the entries with growing alarm. His experience with art crimes and antiquities theft began to provide context for what they were discovering. "Mrs. Thornberry, I'm afraid your husband appears to have been operating as a fence for stolen art and jewelry. These pieces, particularly the ones with royal connections, they may have been taken from official collections." The room suddenly felt colder as the full scope of Richard's secret life became apparent. Camilla sank into a chair that had been positioned near the reading stand, overwhelmed by the realization that her husband had not just been keeping financial secrets from her, but had been involved in criminal activities that could destroy what remained of her reputation and freedom. "What does this mean for me?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Am I responsible for these crimes? Will I be arrested?" Hartwell's expression was sympathetic but grave. "That will depend on what investigation reveals about your knowledge of these activities. The fact that you genuinely seem shocked by this discovery will work in your favor, but you'll need legal representation immediately. These items will have to be seized as evidence, and their rightful ownership will need to be determined." As if responding to his words, several pieces in the collection began to take on sinister new meanings. A small golden statue that she had admired moments earlier now looked like it might have been stolen from an archaeological site. A collection of medieval manuscripts could have been taken from monastery libraries or private collections. Even the beautiful jewelry might represent generations of family heirlooms torn from their rightful owners. At the far end of the chamber, they discovered a section that made Hartwell's phone ring with urgent calls to his superiors. Here, in cases marked with discreet red tags, were items that bore the unmistakable insignia of the British royal family, not replicas or items inspired by royal design, but actual pieces that belonged in the crown jewels collection or other official royal treasuries. "Mrs. Thornberry," Hartwell said after a hushed phone conversation with his headquarters, "I need you to sit down and listen very carefully. Several of these pieces match descriptions of items that have been missing from royal collections for years, some for decades. Your husband appears to have been involved in thefts from the highest levels of British society. The crown that had initially caught their attention was now identified as a piece that had disappeared from a royal estate during renovations 15 years earlier. Its theft had been kept quiet to avoid embarrassing publicity, but it had been actively sought by law enforcement ever since. Other pieces in the collection matched items missing from various royal residences, museum collections, and private estates belonging to the aristocracy. "How is this possible?" Camilla asked, her voice hollow with shock. "Richard was a businessman, not a criminal mastermind. He imported office furniture from Europe. He played golf at the local club and read the Financial Times every morning. How could he have been involved in stealing from the royal family?" Hartwell's investigation training provided some answers, though none of them were comforting. Your husband's legitimate import business would have provided perfect cover for moving valuable objects in and out of the country. Customs officials rarely examine furniture shipments closely, especially from established businesses with clean records. He could have been part of an international network that specialized in acquiring and relocating high-value stolen items. The ledger provided additional clues about the scope of Richard's operation. Entries mentioned contacts in Switzerland, France, and other European countries, suggesting a sophisticated network of dealers and collectors who operated outside legal channels. Some entries referenced the collector in Geneva, or the museum director in Prague, indicating that Richard's activities extended far beyond British borders. Most disturbing of all were recent entries that suggested Richard had been planning one final, massive acquisition before his death. The notes were cryptic but spoke of the ultimate prize and enough to retire forever. Given the scale of what they had already discovered, Camilla shuddered to think what Richard might have considered the crown jewel of his criminal career. Within hours of the discovery, Rayfield Manor was transformed into the center of the most significant art recovery operation in British history. Black vehicles with tinted windows lined the driveway, and men and women in expensive suits moved through the grounds with the quiet efficiency of those accustomed to handling matters of national importance. The local police had been politely but firmly asked to step aside as specialists from Scotland Yard, the art crime unit, and what Camilla suspected were representatives from the royal household itself, took control of the situation. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Montgomery arrived as the sun was setting, her silver hair gleaming under the manor's exterior lights. She carried herself with the authority of someone who had spent decades investigating crimes that never made the newspapers, crimes that threatened the very foundations of British society. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp as they assessed Camilla's emotional state and potential involvement in her husband's criminal enterprises. "Mrs. Thornberry," she began, settling into the morning room that had become an impromptu interview space, "I want you to understand that this investigation has reached the highest levels of government. Some of the items we've recovered from your husband's collection have been missing for so long that their theft was considered unsolvable. Your cooperation in this matter is not just appreciated, it's essential." The photographs spread across the table between them told a story that made Camilla feel physically ill. Each recovered piece had been matched to theft reports dating back decades, creating a timeline of Richard's criminal activity that spanned their entire marriage. The earliest theft dated to just 6 months after their wedding, when a valuable medieval manuscript disappeared from a private library during a social gathering that Richard had attended as her guest. The pattern suggests your husband used his social connections, particularly those he gained through marriage to you, to gain access to valuable private collections, Montgomery explained, her tone professionally neutral despite the devastating implications. Country house parties, charity auctions, gallery openings. These events provided him with opportunities to study security arrangements and identify potential targets. Camilla stared at the photographs, recognizing several locations where she and Richard had been guests over the years. The Ashworth estate, where the diamond tiara had originally belonged. Pemberton Hall, where a collection of rare books had vanished during a weekend shooting party. Dozens of occasions where she had innocently introduced her husband to wealthy collectors, never suspecting that she was providing him with access to his next victims. "I was unknowingly helping him," she said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "All those years, all those social occasions, I was his accomplice without even knowing it." Montgomery's expression softened slightly. "From what we've learned so far, Mrs. Thornberry, you were as much a victim as anyone else. Your husband used your social connections and your genuine friendships to facilitate his crimes. That makes you a victim of manipulation, not a co-conspirator." The investigation team had worked through the night to trace the provenance of the recovered items, and their findings painted a picture of a criminal operation more sophisticated than anyone had initially imagined. Richard hadn't been working alone. The ledger they had found contained coded references to at least 6 other individuals, creating a network of art thieves and dealers that operated across international borders. "We believe your husband was part of what we call a gentleman's network," Montgomery continued. "Wealthy, educated individuals who used their social status to gain access to private collections and royal properties. They would identify valuable items, plan thefts that often went undetected for months or years, and then move the stolen goods through a network of corrupt dealers and private collectors. The most shocking discovery was still being processed by experts from the Royal Collection Trust. The crown they had found in Richard's vault was not just any missing royal artifact, but a piece that had been created for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee and had disappeared from Windsor Castle during the chaos of World War II. Its recovery after nearly 80 years was being hailed as a miracle by royal historians, though its presence in a private home raised questions about security that reached the highest levels of the royal household. Mrs. Thornberry, Montgomery said, leaning forward with increased intensity, we need to discuss your husband's final months. Our analysis of the ledger suggests he was planning something unprecedented, something he called the ultimate acquisition. We believe he may have been attempting to steal something of extraordinary significance before his death, interrupted his plans. The thought that Richard's criminal ambitions might have extended, even beyond what they had already discovered, made Camilla feel faint. She tried to remember any unusual behavior in his final months, any trips or conversations that might provide clues to his ultimate target. There had been increased secrecy, more frequent trips to London, and several mysterious phone calls conducted in whispers behind closed doors. There were calls, she remembered suddenly, late-night conversations that he would end abruptly when I entered the room. And he mentioned meeting with someone he called the Professor, though he never explained who that was or what they discussed. Montgomery made detailed notes, her pen moving quickly across the paper. This professor could be a key figure in the network. We've found similar references in other international art theft cases, suggesting this individual may be a coordinator or broker for high-value stolen items. Do you remember anything else about these conversations? Times, dates, any fragments of discussion you might have overheard? Camilla closed her eyes, trying to recall details that had seemed unimportant at the time, but now might be crucial evidence. He seemed excited about something, more energetic than I'd seen him in years. This was maybe 3 months before he died. He mentioned something about making history and securing our legacy forever. I assumed he was talking about a business deal that would solve our financial problems. The investigation had already revealed that Richard's legitimate import business had been losing money for years, making his criminal activities not just a hobby, but a financial necessity. The profits from stolen art sales had been keeping them afloat, paying for the manor's upkeep and maintaining their social status while gradually accumulating the debts that had ultimately led to this moment. We estimate that your husband's network was responsible for the theft of items worth over £50 million, Montgomery said. The recovery of these pieces will be celebrated internationally, but we need to understand the full scope of the operation to prevent future thefts and to ensure that all stolen items are returned to their rightful owners. As night fell over Rayfield Manor, the investigation team continued their meticulous work. Every item in Richard's vault was being photographed, cataloged, and compared against international databases of stolen art. The process would take weeks, possibly months, as experts from around the world examined pieces that had been missing from their collections for decades. For Camilla, the discovery meant more than just the resolution of her financial problems. The recovered items were worth enough to pay off the estate's debt several times over, but they weren't hers to keep. They belonged to museums, royal collections, and private owners who had been victimized by her husband's crimes. She would be left with nothing except the knowledge that her marriage had been built on a foundation of theft and deception. What happens to me now? She asked Montgomery as the evening interview session concluded. That depends on many factors, the detective replied honestly. You'll need legal representation, and there will be more questions as our investigation continues. But I want you to know that your cooperation today has been invaluable. Without your help, many of these treasures might never have been recovered and the victims might never have known what happened to their stolen property. The revelation of Richard's criminal network sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across 3 continents. Within days of the discovery at Rayfield Manor, coordinated raids were taking place in Geneva, Prague, and Monaco as authorities moved to dismantle what appeared to be one of the most sophisticated art theft operations in modern history. Camilla found herself at the center of an international investigation that stretched from European castles to American museums, all connected by her husband's meticulous records and the testimony she was providing to increasingly senior officials. Detective Chief Inspector Montgomery had been joined by colleagues from Interpol, the FBI's art crime team, and representatives from the French Sûreté, all working together to trace the network that Richard had helped orchestrate. The morning room at Rayfield Manor had been converted into a temporary command center, with secure phone lines, encrypted computers, and a constant stream of evidence arriving from searches conducted around the world. Your husband was more than just a participant in this network, Montgomery explained during one of their extended interview sessions. Our analysis suggests he may have been one of its founding members, possibly even its mastermind. The sophistication of his operation, The quality of his records and the scope of his connections indicate someone with extraordinary organizational abilities. The evidence supporting this theory was overwhelming. Richard's ledger contained detailed profiles of potential targets, security assessments of dozens of properties, and what appeared to be strategic plans for expanding the network's operations into new geographic regions. Most disturbing were his psychological evaluations of potential victims, noting their weaknesses, their financial vulnerabilities, and the social connections that could be exploited to gain access to their valuables. Among the recovered documents was a leather portfolio containing photographs and floor plans of properties that had never been burglarized, suggesting that Richard had been planning future operations that his death had prevented. Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and several major European royal residences were included in these reconnaissance files, indicating ambitions that reached the highest levels of society. The professor, the mysterious figure Richard had mentioned in his final months, was identified through communications recovered from a Swiss bank safety deposit box. Professor Heinrich Müller, a respected art historian from Vienna, had been using his academic credentials to gain access to private collections and museum storage facilities across Europe. His scholarly reputation provided the perfect cover for identifying valuable pieces that could be stolen without immediate detection. The international scope of the investigation revealed that Richard's network had been responsible for some of the most notorious unsolved art thefts of the past 3 decades. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist in Boston, previously attributed to organized crime, showed connections to materials found in Richard's vault. Several pieces stolen from the Louvre during renovation work in the 1990s were traced through financial records that led directly back to the network's Swiss banking arrangements. Your husband's death may have prevented the largest art theft in history, Montgomery told Camilla during a particularly intense briefing session. We found evidence that the network was planning to steal the crown jewels themselves during the Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations. The chaos and security focus on public events would have provided the perfect cover for accessing normally impregnable storage areas. The plan, detailed in encrypted files recovered from the professor's computer, was breathtakingly ambitious. Network members would use their social connections to gain positions on various royal event committees, providing them with detailed knowledge of security arrangements and access schedules. The actual theft would have been conducted during the height of the public celebrations, when all attention was focused on the external ceremony rather than internal security. Richard's role in this ultimate heist would have been crucial, as his import business provided the infrastructure needed to move the stolen crown jewels out of the country, quickly and discreetly. Specially modified shipping containers designed to shield their contents from X-ray scanners and metal detectors had already been constructed and were waiting in warehouses across London. The profit from such a theft would have been unprecedented, Montgomery explained. Not from selling the crown jewels themselves, which would have been impossible, but from holding them ransom. The network planned to demand not money, but the release of political prisoners and the implementation of various social policies. They saw themselves as modern-day Robin Hood figures, using art theft to fund political change. This revelation transformed Camilla's understanding of her husband's motivations from simple greed to something far more complex and disturbing. Richard hadn't just been stealing valuable objects for personal profit. He had been part of a movement that viewed art theft as a form of political activism, a way to redistribute wealth and challenge established power structures. The investigation team showed her communications between Richard and other network members that revealed his genuine belief in their cause. He wrote passionately about the injustice of valuable art being locked away in private collections, while public museums struggled for funding. He argued that stealing from the wealthy and redistributing their treasures was not just acceptable, but morally necessary. Your husband saw himself as a revolutionary, Montgomery said, someone who was fighting against centuries of inequality and privilege. In his mind, he wasn't a common thief but a freedom fighter using unconventional methods to create social change. The international raids had netted dozens of arrests and recovered artwork worth hundreds of millions of pounds, but they had also revealed the true scope of the network's infiltration into legitimate society. Museum curators, auction house experts, security consultants, and even some law enforcement officials had been providing assistance to the network, creating a web of corruption that reached into every level of the art world. Several major auction houses were now under investigation for knowingly selling stolen pieces, while museums around the world were conducting inventories to determine what might have been taken from their collections through insider assistance. The ripple effects of Richard's network would be felt throughout the international art community for years to come. For Camilla, these revelations brought a mixture of relief and profound sadness. The knowledge that Richard's crimes had been motivated by political beliefs rather than simple greed provided some comfort, but it also meant that their entire marriage had been built on a lie. Every conversation about current events, every discussion of social issues, every charitable donation they had made together had been colored by his secret revolutionary activities. The personal cost of the investigation was becoming overwhelming. Media attention had made it impossible for her to remain at Rayfield Manor, and she had been forced to accept protective custody in a safe house while the legal proceedings continued. Her friends had distanced themselves, unsure whether she had been complicit in Richard's crimes. Even her sister in Scotland had expressed doubts about taking her in permanently. "Mrs. Thornberry," Montgomery said gently, "I know this has been incredibly difficult for you, but I want you to know that your cooperation has been instrumental in breaking up one of the most dangerous criminal networks in modern history. Dozens of stolen treasures have been returned to their rightful owners, and future thefts have been prevented. That's a legacy you can be proud of, regardless of your husband's choices." 6 months after the discovery that changed everything, Camilla stood in the witness box at the Old Bailey, facing a courtroom filled with victims of her husband's network, journalists from around the world, and legal representatives seeking justice for decades of sophisticated art theft. The trial had become a sensation, dubbed by the press as the Crown Jewels conspiracy, and her testimony would be crucial in securing convictions against the surviving members of Richard's criminal organization. The woman who took the oath that morning bore little resemblance to the sheltered aristocrat who had once presided over country house parties at Rayfield Manor. Months of investigation, legal proceedings, and painful self-reflection had transformed Camilla into someone who understood the difference between innocence and willful ignorance. Her designer clothes had been replaced by a simple black suit, her elaborate jewelry was gone, and her once perfect composure showed the strain of confronting uncomfortable truths about her life and marriage. "Mrs. Thornberry," the prosecutor began gently, "please tell the court about the moment you discovered your husband's secret chamber." As Camilla recounted the events of that shocking day, photographs of the recovered treasures were displayed on screens throughout the courtroom. The Queen Victoria Diamond Jubilee crown, now safely returned to the royal collection, glittered under the courtroom lights as evidence of the network's audacious crimes. Each piece she described brought murmurs from the gallery, where representatives of victim families sat alongside museum curators and art historians whose collections had been plundered over the decades. The most emotional moment came when she was asked to read portions of Richard's final letter, the one that had revealed the access code to his vault. Her voice shook as she repeated his words about making mistakes and bringing danger to their door, but also his twisted justification for crimes he had portrayed as noble acts of social justice. "Did you ever suspect that your husband was involved in criminal activities?" the prosecutor asked. "No," Camilla replied firmly. "Richard was secretive about his business affairs, but I attributed that to old-fashioned ideas about protecting me from financial worries. I never imagined that the man I shared my life with for 30 years was living a completely separate existence as an art thief and revolutionary." The defense attorneys for the captured network members tried to portray Camilla as either complicit or willfully blind to obvious signs of her husband's criminal activities. They pointed to the expensive lifestyle the couple had maintained despite Richard's supposedly failing business, the valuable insurance policies on items she claimed never to have seen, and her convenient ignorance of his frequent mysterious trips and secret meetings. But Detective Chief Inspector Montgomery's testimony thoroughly dismantled these arguments. The investigation had revealed that Richard had been extraordinarily careful to compartmentalize his criminal activities, using legitimate business transactions to explain unusual financial activities and maintaining the facade of a struggling but respectable import business. Even trained investigators would have found it difficult to detect his true activities without the discovery of the hidden chamber. Mr. Thornberry was a master of deception, Montgomery told the court. His wife was not an accomplice but another victim of his manipulation. Her shock at discovering the vault and her complete cooperation with our investigation demonstrate someone who had genuinely been kept in the dark about her husband's criminal career. The trial revealed the full scope of the network's activities, including details about planned future heists that Richard's death had prevented. The Crown Jewels operation would have been followed by similar attempts on the treasures of other European royal families, with the ultimate goal of forcing governments to address income inequality and social justice issues through criminal extortion. Professor Muller, testifying from a Swiss prison where he was awaiting extradition, painted Richard as the network's visionary leader, someone who had transformed what began as simple art theft into a complex political movement. The professor's academic credentials had provided legitimacy and access, but Richard's social connections and business infrastructure had made their grand schemes possible. The international investigation had ultimately recovered over £200 million worth of stolen art and artifacts, returning treasures to museums, private collectors, and royal families across Europe and North America. Many pieces had been missing for so long that their recovery was hailed as miraculous, bringing closure to cold cases that had frustrated law enforcement for decades. For the victims who testified, the trial provided not just legal resolution but emotional healing. Lady Pemberton, whose family's medieval manuscripts had been stolen during a house party 15 years earlier, spoke tearfully about the cultural heritage that had been returned to her ancestors' collection. Museum directors described the joy of reuniting their institutions with masterpieces that had been mourned as lost forever. The sentencing phase brought a mixture of justice and mercy. The surviving network members received lengthy prison terms, with Professor Muller facing the harshest punishment due to his role as the organization's intellectual architect. Several corrupt officials and art world insiders received lighter sentences in exchange for their cooperation in ongoing investigations of related criminal networks. For Camilla, the legal resolution brought an unexpected form of redemption. The court recognized her status as a victim rather than an accomplice, and the Crown granted her immunity from prosecution in exchange for her continued cooperation with international investigations. More importantly, several grateful victims and institutions established a trust fund that would provide her with modest financial security for the remainder of her life. Your courage in revealing your husband's crimes and cooperating with this investigation has served the cause of justice magnificently, the judge told her during the final hearing. While you cannot escape the personal tragedy of discovering that your marriage was built on deception, you can take pride in the role you played in returning stolen treasures to their rightful owners and preventing future crimes. The trust fund allowed Camilla to rent a small cottage in the Cotswolds, far from the scene of her former life but close enough to visit the few friends who had remained loyal through the scandal. Rayfield Manor had been sold to pay the estate's remaining debts, but she found unexpected peace in the simplicity of her new circumstances. Without the burden of maintaining appearances and managing a grand estate, she discovered interests and abilities that had been suppressed during her years as a society hostess. She began volunteering with victim support groups, helping other people who had discovered that their lives were built on lies and deception. Her unique experience and hard-won wisdom provided comfort to those struggling with the aftermath of betrayal and financial ruin. The work gave her life new meaning and purpose, transforming her from a victim of circumstances into an advocate for others facing similar challenges. On quiet evenings in her cottage garden, Camilla sometimes reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this place. The discovery of Richard's crimes had destroyed everything she thought she knew about her life, but it had also freed her from illusions that had prevented her from truly living. She was poorer in material terms but richer in self-knowledge and genuine relationships. The Queen Victoria Diamond Jubilee crown, safely restored to its place in royal history, had become an unlikely symbol of both the corruption that had threatened Britain's cultural heritage and the power of truth to overcome even the most sophisticated deceptions. For Camilla, it represented the possibility of redemption and the hope that even the most devastating betrayals could ultimately serve a greater good.